Unit 4 पेज नंबर 19 कसा काढणार? हेच ना आपलं क्लोज. The religion of the future, Charles Bernard Shaw. Bernard Shaw, The Religion of the Future. I was a young man. I was born in year 1856, when my mind was being formed, as they say, I had very great hopes of science, and the people at that time had extraordinary hopes of science because science came to us as a deliver from the old evangelicalism, which had become entirely intolerable. There are some of course people of the old evangelical type about, but I do not think there are any of them here because I am not the sort of preacher they run after, but I can. When it was quite a general belief that had a perfectly distinct image. He was an elderly gentleman. He had a white beard. I am an elderly gentleman, and I had a white beard, but I am not a bit like him. Nevertheless, there is a gentleman friend of mine and a socialist who is exactly like him, and that is my friend, Mr. H. M. Yanman. Those of you who know him will recognize that the God who was believed in my youth was like. If you have not had the privilege of meeting Mr. Yanman, you had better seek it. If you get black illustrations to job you will find a picture of the old gentleman there. You may remember how this was focused by the tremendous sensation which was made by Ibsen, the uh, first play with which he practically stormed Europe was the play brand. The one thing one always remember it that the hero meets a young man and these discuss a little theology and brand says your good is an your God is an old man. I have no use for him. That really I think was the first time it suddenly flashed on Europe that after all, supposing God were to be convinced as a young man. I remembered when I had it pushed into me that everything that was precious was old, even when I read the Pilgrim's Progress, which I had meant a very small child. When I came to the second part, even Mr. Valiant of Truth, I convinced as an old man. At any rate, a a grown-up person. I remember my surprise afterwards when arriving at years of discretion to discover by carefully reading the introduction in verse which is a child always skips that Bunyan had convinced Valiant for truth as being a young man in all the glory of youth. But in those days, the rulers of the universe was an elderly gentleman, and you had to be very carefully about that elderly gentleman because the one thing he was watching to do at every turn was to strike you dead. You used to be told if you were not very careful. There was always one phrase used if you said anything that implied the slightest doubt about that old gentleman. You were told that you would come home on a shutter. I had when a young vision of the blasphemers, the atheist, the infidel, always being brought home on a shutter. They were never brought home in an ambulance, a hearse, or any other way, but always on a shutter. I can remember too when I was a young man. I was at a bachelor party and they began to dispute about religion. There was a pious party. There had there was a young man who evidently was a bit of a secularist, and they began disputing about Charles Bardolph, who was the great atheist preacher of that day. It was alleged he had on one occasion in a public taken out his watch and challenged his God. This old elderly gentleman, he really excited, and if he were the truth, to strike him dead within 5 minutes. Well, you have no idea of the bitterness of the controversy. The pious people, of course, alleged it as being the most frightful and horrible defiance of God that could be convinced, but the secularists, instead of taking the line you would accept in meeting for all. Hi, madam. केलं नाही. The pious people, of course, alleged it has been the most fruitful and horrible defense of God that could be convinced, but the secularists, instead of taking the line you would accept, passionately denied the Barlav and done anything of the kind. He said the Barlav was too good a man. I said, look here, after all, if people do believe this crude thing that the world is regulated by a very touchy deity who strikes people dead in not that a very practical way of testing it. And with that, I took my watch out of my pocket. You have no idea of the effect it produced. Both the secularist party and the pious party went into transport of terror. That was what is called religion. When you have got such a horrible oppression, the whole thing is such a nightmare that if anybody will come and offer any kind of argument by which you can convince yourself you can get rid of it, you will jump at it without being very critical. The argument that people found most difficult to get over was the argument from design. You know the old argument, if a savage took up a watch and saw the way it was arranged, even he would say it was not a casual or accidental growth, that it was a thing designed by a designer. Thus, in the middle of the century, evolution had been entirely forgotten. Evolution was first introduced about the year 1780, and until 1830 it was very much it, in men's mind it was very much discussed, but in 1830 discussion about it had been exhausted and it was almost forgotten. Then Charles Darwin, a grandson of one of the oldest evolutionists, Erasmus Darwin, suddenly made a discovery with Alfred Russel Wallace, not of evolution, but a particular method which stimulated evolution, which was called natural selection. You are all probably familiar with Darwin's natural selection, but the point that affects our argument tonight is this, that Darwin was able to show that case after case of what appeared to be the most exi- ex- exquisite adaptation of means of time. The most perfect evidence of design, apparently unquestionable cases of things having seen made by design for a things having been made for design for a particular purpose was nothing of the kind. That simply the pressure of environment had produced the appearance. To put it roughly, suppose there was a hole in a wall and somebody found a cannonball near it, which exactly fitted. People used to say that was the very clearest evidence that some intelligent person made that hole is the wall to fit the cannon. Darwin showed it was entirely wrongly the cannonball and knocked the hole in the wall, and nobody meant the hole to be there at all. That is what natural selection means, as opposed to the old evolution. And there came, as you know, a fierce controversy between Samuel Butler, whose life some of who have been reading, and Darwin. People are rather puzzled at the extraordinary curiosity of the quarrel. I have very often told the story, though it is not told in the biography, of Butler saying to me in the country yard of the British Museum, in a dogged kind of a way, my grandfather quarreled with Darwin's grandfather. My father quarreled with Darwin's father. I quarreled with Darwin, and my only regret is not having a son is that he cannot quarrel with Darwin's son. Many people reading the biography cannot understand why Butler was so extraordinary, bitter, but the reason was that he was one of the first men to perceive the full significance and means of the natural selection of Darwin's, which was taken up by the scientific world and then by the whole world and embraced with the most extraordinary enthusiasm as being a new revelation of the beginning of science and was applied to everything, so that people declared that the whole mass of evolution had been a matter of natural selection. Butler said, this doctrine banishes mind of the universe. It presents you with a universe which no man with any capacity for real thought dare face. For a moment, it takes all design, all conscience, although out of it, and the whole thing becomes a senseless accident and Nothing else. My mind refused to enter that, entertain that, and then Butler set himself to work out that genius evolution was, and although all through his life, Butler was very much slighted, and everyone thought Darwin was one of the greatest men of the science that ever existed. Now we are all coming around to Butler's view. Darwin is one of the famous scientists. Darwin's theory, if you go to see, you can see Darwin's theory in science. Okay, it is very much famous. But why was it people jumped at Darwin in that way? As a rule, people are not fond of science. They are not much giving to study it. The reason simply was that Darwin destroyed the oldest evi- evangelicalism, the conception of the continuously interfering and elderly gentleman with the white bread, who was constantly sending people some of a shutter. He took that weight of the human mind, and people were so enormously relieved to get rid of it that they emptied the baby out of the bath. They practically threw aside everything, and they had a curious notion that since the old evangelical view that had been taught in connection with mortality, morality. Mortality is different, morality is different. Okay, here we are saying morality. Then they had not only got rid of the mistakes and crudities and superstitions of the old evangelicalism, but they they believed that had got rid of religion and right and wrong altogether. And we entered on a period of pragmatism and materialism, which has lasted for 50 years and which has ended in one of the most appalling wars the world had ever seen. You can trace that war exactly to these purely materialistic idea. We are very fond of blaming the Germans for these. Let us not forget it was an Englishman, Darwin, who had banished mind from the universe. We have occasionally said the Germans are only imitators of us, that they steal our inventions and ideas. म्हणजे त्यावेळेस सुद्धा ज्या काही नवीन इन्व्हेन्शन्स आणि आयडियाज व्हायच्या त्या पण चोरीला जायच्या. आय एम अफ्रेड in this case it is right. They did steal scientific materialistic ideas and works of them, but in that particular it is not for us to throw stones. England is undoubtedly, but the place those ideas came from the first instance. Such a thing cannot last. It is too entirely against all our poetic instinct. One knows, particularly as Butler knew, that we cannot empty the universe out like that and make the whole thing to be a series of accidents. We know there is an intention and purpose in the universe because there is intention and purpose in us. People have said, where is this purpose, this intention? I say it is here. It is in me. I felt it. I directly experience it. I, it, and so do you. And you need not try and look as if you didn't. It is like a man saying, "Where is the soul?" I am always, I always say to a materialist of that kind, "Can you tell me the difference between a live body and a dead one? Can you find out the life? What was happened? What has happened? Here is a man struck by a shell. What has happened? He is made of exactly the same chemical as before, the same silica, the man carbon, the same carbon. You can find no difference whatever, but somehow he ceased to live and he is going to tumble to bits. What kept him that strange, fantastic shape for so many years? What keeps me in these definite shapes? Why do I not stumble into my constituent chemicals? None of these material people can tell me that. It was that continually question when people began to get fitfully bored by being told everything was sodium and carbon and all that they said. Okay, thank you for the day.